So look, I'm Alex Ruff. I'm the Member of Parliament for Bruce Grey Owen Sound, but more importantly, I'm doing this interview and this opportunity here with the Billy Bishop Museum to talk about my military career. Over 25 and a half years in the Canadian Armed Forces as an infantry officer with the Royal Canadian Regiment. 5 overseas deployments, 2 in Bosnia, 2 in Afghanistan, and 1 in Iraq. But I'm going to specifically talk about my time in Afghanistan. So my first deployment to Afghanistan was in 2007, late January, early February, as the company commander of Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, where I had the privilege of commanding a square combat team for the majority of that 6-month deployment. I'll get into a bit more details later. And as well, my second deployment when I was actually the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, in 2012, when we deployed back as the Canadian contribution to the training mission Afghanistan under the NATO training mission Afghanistan up in Kabul, which was an 8-month deployment where I took half my battalion back along with a number of other senior officers across the Canadian Armed Forces, where we're really focused on capacity building. But again, we'll get into those details as I talk about 2012. But those are my 2 deployments in Afghanistan. So the first time I got over there was actually in 2006, just right after Operation Medusa, which at that time was the biggest NATO offensive military operation in the history, really since Korea for Canada, and under Canadian leadership as well, with General Fraser as the division commander and Lieutenant Colonel Omer Lavoie, who was commanding the 1st Battalion of the RCR at the time. So what we went over with is the tactical reconnaissance, or TAC Recce as we call it. We deployed in September of 2006, so just a couple weeks after Medusa, to go over, see the lay of the ground as a company commander, to understand what we were getting ourselves into, to ensure that the training would be appropriate. So interesting, sort of lots of hops to get ourselves over there. We actually flew on one of our Airbuses that was converted for cargo only on an emergency resupply of ammunition and other supplies. So the whole back part of the aircraft was nothing but ammunition, really. I can't remember the final weight, but it was something, it was pretty incredible to get it over there, because they obviously had gone through a lot more ammunition than envisioned during Operation Medusa. From there, we got read into the briefs. I do remember quite the final leg coming in from Camp Mirage into Kandahar Airfield. It was all tactical flying at the time, nape of the earth as they call it. And as somebody that tends to get motion sickness very easily, needless to say, it was not enjoyable. And I've done this a few times, when you're basically throwing up in your mouth and swallowing it back down in order to survive getting in there. And of course, as the temperature continues to increase as you're getting lower and lower in elevation as you're landing, it's the sweat's pouring off of you, you're jammed in like sardines. But we got in there okay, and then we've got a number of briefings. I got to link up with then Major Mike Wright and his company commander, Sergeant Major Hoye, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, out at Patrol Base Wilson after a couple days. And Major Wright now is still serving. He's actually a Major General, commanding our intelligence command, basically, the Canadian Forces Intelligence Command. He's still serving, but phenomenal officer. So I'd known Mike since really our RMC days. He was at the Royal Military College about 3 years ahead of me, if my memory's correct, and we had interacted a few times before that. But I'll never forget, Mike gave me was up giving me a brief at the top of the command post at Patrol Base Wilson, when a watch officer, one of the sergeants or warrant officers, came up to pass on the terrible news that he had just lost 4 of his soldiers to a bicycle IED. And so they obviously took off, him and his sergeant major, quite quickly. Left myself back at the patrol base to go link up at the scene, which was only a few kilometers away. And then within a few hours, obviously I'm seeing those 4 fallen heroes, their remains coming into the camp. And then a few hours after that, I'm actually back out with Mike and his combat team on the ground, being briefed, and the leadership, the resolution that existed within his soldiers was nothing short of awe-inspiring to see there, and just how strong but how resolute they were to continue the mission and to pay respect, but to carry on with what they needed to do, because at that time they're only a few months, they're only about halfway through their deployment, if that. And so took a lot of, learned a lot just from that experience. Was out with them for the next 24, 48 hours before we drove back into Kandahar Airfield. And then myself and the rest of the tactical reconnaissance, we did that ramp ceremony at Kandahar Airfield. We did it again at Camp Mirage. We did it again with that, because we rode with the remains right back to Trenton, and did the ramp ceremony again there before we got back to, for the flight. The plane actually flew us back to Gagetown, New Brunswick, which is where we were based out of at the time. So needless to say, for the remaining few months in the next opportunity, I got to brief my soldiers as we continued our training. I knew exactly what we were getting ourselves into, and that unfortunately there was a good probability that not everybody was going to come home. So it was eye-opening, and at the same time almost you couldn't really ask for better preparation, I guess, before we eventually deployed. So training continued, and obviously went through our full workup training. The Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian Army deliver some of the best training in the world, and I honestly believe we were well prepared for our own mission when we went out the door in late January of 2007. And at that time, because of what happened in Medusa, tanks had then been deployed, and I'm sure some of the other people that have maybe talked here have talked about getting our tanks and armored units into Afghanistan. But we were the first sort of that had the opportunity to train together and then deploy with A Squadron from the Lord Strathcona Horse, and so they deployed with us, and so we got over there in end January, early February, and again, weather's not quite the same. It was actually the easiest way from a weather transition perspective when we got onto the ground, because what it allowed us to do is actually acclimatize a little bit. For the first little bit, at the time Route Summit was just being sort of finished up, so the majority of the battle group was actually tied to terrain and tied to camps or patrol bases or forward operating bases. I was sort of the lone maneuver element, along with the squadron of tanks that were still there under then command of Major Trevor Cadieux, who just recently retired from the Canadian Armed Forces as a Lieutenant General. Very phenomenal leader that I had the opportunity to learn a lot from him. He'd been on the ground partway through, because again, they hadn't deployed initially until the tanks rolled over. So the other companies, India Company was tied to ground. Our Charlie Company of 3 PPCLI that was attached to us as the 2 RCR battle group hadn't deployed yet, because again, due to changes in the composition of the battle groups, they had it was a sort of a last-minute decision to train them up on the Nyala. The previous battle groups had gone over with Love W's or Iltises and like old, not our top-of-the-line equipment. So they were actually a few weeks late, not late, but just delayed in getting into theater. So they were tied to ground. So ultimately, the first part of the deployment, I was actually the only sort of freewheeling maneuver element of the battle group. And shortly after we got on the ground, we were deployed on Op Achilles, which was the RC South, which is the Division Regional Command South operation that was actually going on in Helmand Province, in particular in the Sangin Valley, under where the Brits were located, and we were what was called the reserve as a combat team. So I had my combat team, i.e. 2 platoons out of my infantry company. I had sent one of my platoons off to augment one of the other locations, but I had half the squadron of tanks with me. I had a troop of artillery that was deployed sort of out in between. We had electronic warfare capability. We had a bunch of other assets that were sort of attached to us. And we were out sort of maneuvering around in the Mainland Desert, which is on the western part of Kandahar province, just as it borders Helmand. And so we had the most combat power, ground-based combat power of any military or coalition force in Afghanistan at the time. So a lot of weight, a lot of capability, and so not a lot happened. Lots of chatter. We did get into, I believe, February 10th, but the date might be wrong. I might be off by a little bit. We got into our first sort of ambush right near where Mullah Omar, who is sort of the father of the Taliban, his home location in the Hausi Madad area of Panjwai or Zari district. And I remember we got opened up on about 3 different spots, so it was a little bit chaotic. We did have local Afghan police with us, and it's too bad I didn't have my LAV captain, then Captain Dave Nixon, here to tell his story, because it basically opened up the whole ambush with what we call a negligence discharge with a RPG by the Taliban. They were sneaking up and trying to engage Dave's light armored vehicle, when, as they were climbing over the wall, they basically shot it straight up in the air. So it gave Dave and his gunner time to react, and needless to say, it didn't pan out too well for the Taliban. But that went on for a few hours, and that was sort of our first experience commanding troops in combat, but it wasn't a sustained sort of threat. And we got it sorted out fairly quickly. After that, things went fairly quiet for the next couple months, other than the most traumatic experience of my life, just as Op Achilles was finishing up. And what we were doing a lot of the time as part of that to support the resources and the convoys that would roll into Helmand province is I was doing convoy escort up through the desert, sometimes upwards of 80 to 100 vehicles, moving them 40-50 kilometers, and we'd be spread out sometimes almost 20 kilometers across the desert. But unfortunately on April 8th, 2007, as we were doing really our last convoy escort, I'd set call sign 2-2, one of my platoons, out to, after we had already deployed forward. I was, myself and one of my other platoons, and with some tanks as convoy escort, because if you understand the terrain, I don't think we have a map right here, but when you get up to the Sangan Valley, there's a mountain range that runs in between, and so I told the platoon commander, Ben Rogerson, to set up basically in between, to act as a radio rebroadcasting capability, RB, and they deployed out afterwards. And just as we were finishing up the escort, unfortunately they hit an IED as they were maneuvering through a Kerez system, and the Kerez system is the series of irrigation holes or wells that they dig to find the water as they're going across the desert. And sometimes those holes will be 50, 100 feet, 200 feet apart. Sometimes they get quite narrow. Unfortunately, they were quite narrow in the location when they hit the system, and they went through the first widest spot that they found. And unfortunately, the Taliban had put down a very large pressure point improvised explosive device, and it took out the lead vehicle and killed 6 of my soldiers that day. Sergeant Dunn, all the ones that were, 6 of them were in the back, the air sentry in the back. Sean Fevens actually survived. He's still serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, although he's in the Air Force now. Decided enough with the ground Army stuff. After that, the gunner, the crew commander, and the driver all survived as well. So 6 out of the 10, though, did perish that were in the back below. And Sergeant Donnie Lucas, Corporal Aaron Williams, Corporal Brent Poland, Corporal Christopher Stanix, Private David Greenslade, and Private Kevin Kennedy. And I just remember that day as the worst day of my life. When it first came over, it comes over the radio as, it was a bit broken because, again, that's the issue. We were at the length of our sort of communications, and it came over as, IED hit or something like that. 2 VSA, more casualties. VSA, vital signs absent. And then again, you're trying to clarify that, ask for them to say again. And by the time it sort of clarity got through, it was up to 6. And I was about 20 some kilometers away with my TAC at the time. I passed direction on to the platoon commander to get everybody else back once the convoy was fully handed off, and told my driver and the rest of my TAC. So in my tactical sort of setup, I had 3 other armored vehicles with me, and it's follow me kind of deal, and told the driver to put the pedal to the floor. And I don't think it took us very long to cross that 20 kilometers through the desert and get to the site where the incident had occurred. And fortunately, we got the survivors to back to Kandahar Airfield. Medevac airlift came in to get them out, and then we dealt with the cleanup. And it took us about 24 hours to get the site cleaned up. In the end, once it was all said and done, we brought out capabilities to investigate the site. That's an important thing that we did at the time in Afghanistan, to try to determine what went right, or how was it caused, etc. So we had experts that would come out. They came out, we did that. And then when it was all said and done, we cleaned up the site with having a combat team with armored engineer vehicles, etc. We were able to basically leave the place in pristine condition, but it was a massive IED that the one tire alone off the vehicle was about 300 meters away from where the vehicle had been hit. It was about 50 feet from where the vehicle was hit to where it stopped. The tail ramp, which I don't know how many, weighs a couple tons I think by itself, was blowing off of it, etc. But we cleaned everything up, we recovered the vehicle, and I walked the site afterwards, and to this day, I still wear my dog tags, and this washer is the only thing I found on the ground, and I wear it every day just so I'll never forget those 6 guys. And to me, that's just an important way to pay tribute and to never forget them. And so that was sort of the worst day of my life, and was tough on everybody, and it took us a while, but it was at the tail end of this really 35-day operation non-stop out in the desert. After that, when we went back to Kandahar Airfield and did the ramp ceremony, etc., we did have about a week or so, a week and a half, before my troops or we were back outside the wire, as we called it. But it was important to get everybody back, including the survivors, other than Sean Fevens, who was obviously medevaced back to Canada. But those guys needed to come back, although, to be frank, there's still lots of my soldiers from that deployment, from that platoon, and especially that section 22 Bravo, as they were called, still dealing with a lot of mental health issues and personal challenges. I think in particular the engineer section that I'd asked to clear the vehicle before the remains were removed, because I was concerned at the time of possible unexploded ordnance. I don't know if any of those guys are 100% well to this day, because seeing something like that is so traumatic. Anyway, we got through that. Shortly, then things sort of, was back to normal, as things are in Afghanistan and in Kandahar at the time. And then come May though, as poppy harvest season ends, we call it fighting season starts. And I actually had Lisa Laflamme, now national CTV national news broadcaster, embedded with my combat team at the time. We had lost, at the time, Canada didn't have a whole lot of what we called route clearance packages. We were dependent upon the Americans for these combination of using technology like x-rays and probes to go around to basically clear the routes as we were moving down any of the roads from IEDs. So it wasn't my idea. It was, I think, a lot of the credit goes to then Rusty King, our Deputy Commanding Officer of the Battle Group, Major Russ King. I think he was one of the guys that thought of it. But we had the mine rollers for the tanks over there, so they hadn't been used at all in operations, I think, since Korea. And we put the mine rollers on in front of the tanks. And so I still remember it took us a while. There's actually national news coverage of that day that is out there where we loaded them up. Took us a little while to get them all set up. Again, just right off the main highway, heading south out of Housing Madads into the Nelgram area. We had intelligence that there was likely there was Taliban in the area, and we were patrolling to go down there. Well, needless to say, we were only a few hundred meters down the road, and it's very sort of, they're built up mud walls, etc., that were in location that the ambushes started, and all hell sort of broke loose, and it got quite chaotic. And so we were dealing with that. I did not have all my combat power spread out. We were still under sort of some interesting, I don't want to say restrictions, but considerations, because after Op Medusa and it had done such damage to the Taliban, and things had sort of settled down, especially during the winter, there was a lot of concern about collateral damage, because when it ran that big major operation, that Operation Medusa was, there had been obviously a lot of damage to structures, walls, local infrastructure, that you don't want to do that damage, because again, it's the civilians that end up losing access to some of their housing or farming capabilities, etc. So we were very conscious of not to doing that, and we've been sort of under, not orders I should say, but to minimize any impact on collateral damage to local infrastructure, including the wadis, etc., because the wadis are the irrigation ditches, and when they're full, if we block them or fill them in order to cross them with our vehicles, and again, that's the great thing about having armored engineer vehicles, these tanks, bulldozers basically, some of them with blades, the water can quickly flood and go wherever. So we were under constraints to do that. So when the attack started, things got going on. It did end up going on for a number of hours. We had close air support immediately on standby. We had attack helicopters that rolled in, and as soon as they show up, the Taliban go to ground quite quickly. But lots going on there, especially for the lead elements of my combat team. It was the first time that the new tank squadron fellows that were on the ground, and I can remember specifically after things we've been fighting going on. I'm obviously commanding everything from my vehicle, and you hear it come over the radio after things had settled down, because when the helicopters show up, everything goes quiet, because the Taliban aren't that dumb to know that if they keep firing when there's attack helicopters up in the air, they're not going to be around much longer. They disappeared, and then things were kind of quiet, and the next thing I hear over the radio from the lead Tango call sign, the lead tank, is basically, I got two fighting age males 200 meters to my front with AK-47s or RPGs moving left to right. I'm observing. Needless to say, my comments back over the radio were a little bit more frank. Quit observing and kill maybe a few expletives, engage them, because obviously we're in the middle of a firefight. But again, when soldiers, like anybody, when they're engaged or involved in the first time, it's not easy to take another life or to even engage, especially if somebody's not firing back at you in the heat of it. And so anyway, it all got done. Afterwards, when we basically rolled up that operation. We could identify a number of IEDs. We didn't have the resources. We weren't going to go into their game plan. We basically, after a number of hours and things had settled down, we were no longer going to carry on with the mission for that day. So we pulled back to Patrol Base Wilson again to sort of reset ourselves up and reconsolidate, come up with a better plan for the next day. And that's when I found out from my lab captain, Dave, again, who had Lisa Laflemme and her camera crew with her, that she was quite upset. I'll say that because she wanted, unlike some of the other media that embedded with us, most of it was print media, they were quite content to be at the back, interview us after the fact, get their story, beam it back via satellite, back to get the stories back in Canada. This is national news, CTV, that wanted video, and she hadn't got any video, so she had been bugging Dave. He said throughout, it's like, I think Major Ruff, I think he needs you to move forward, and trying to get his lab to move forward a number of times in order to get video footage. So she was a little disappointed back at Patrol Base Wilson that night because she didn't get the coverage that she necessarily wanted. But the next day we rolled back out. I actually got an A&A company attached to us, so we had another couple hundred soldiers that were attached to me to roll in the next day. We came in farther from the west into Nelgam. We did hit another massive IED with one of the tanks. Took the tank out, nobody injured though, but disabled the tank. And again, if I was showing you on the map here, although we hit a big wadi system as we were going in order to get into the village area that we wanted to go in and patrol and clear of any potential Taliban, I was already dismounted with all my soldiers, with the A&A, when again they decided to start a fight with us. When I was set up for what I would call almost a perfect right flanking, and so not like the day before, we were well distributed out and from a tactical standpoint. So we got into that. Again, Lisa Laflemme and her camera crew were only about 20 feet behind me, so they got live footage. I think it was the first sort of national media live footage of anything that had gone on at Afghanistan. Prior to that, everything had been provided really by soldiers themselves from what they had shot on their own cameras, phones, etc., and not or provided by military media or publications, public affairs. So it was a little bit different then. That carried on for, again, a few hours before we cleaned out and cleaned up the site. I know I got myself in a bit of trouble afterwards because, of course, I'm being interviewed almost in real time in the consolidation phase, with Lisa asking me questions and interviewing some of my soldiers, but we got through that. And I do know I kind of messed up, and I didn't in the initial interview provide her any actual Taliban casualties, but one of the things that you try to avoid in a counterinsurgency is talking about number of killed in action, number of enemy dead, because it's not about the count. In the end, it's not about killing bad guys and who wins that sort of fight. It's really about winning the hearts and minds and getting the people on board. And so you don't want to get into that. But of course, the heat of it all, she's asking questions. I let slip that there's 23 less Taliban or so running around. Fortunately, no injuries on our side. And I got in a bit of trouble from the general, I think, after the fact, or reminded not to be talking about that when we did that. And that was my first, actually, when we did get back to Canada Airfield within a couple days, doing a media scrum. The first time real exposure to that, where you got umpteen different media outlets all throwing cameras and yelling questions at you, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the kickoff of fighting season of 2007, and then from there everybody got involved, and it just never really stopped for the next, 4 or 5 months really. We were supposed to be doing this big final sort of 24-hour operation, and when orders changed, up in Gorak, which was again a little bit farther north outside our sort of normal area of operations, the Afghan police post had been hit, and a number of had been sort of almost overrun by Taliban, and they were in damage. But there had been a Afghan police reinforcement that had gone up and basically had been wiped out en route to get there to reinforce them. So now they were going to send up a company of Afghan army with myself escorting them again. So we made that move. Unfortunately, you do hit 1 or 2 IEDs en route. We slowed us up a little bit, but we didn't run into any combat. We got in there, and Don Martin, who was with us, we got in there. Again, nothing happened. We set up. We started calling for reinforcements. We needed to rebuild the Hesco bastions, which are the big sort of the big steel structures with the burlap or whatever. It's a thick thing, but these are in general about 20 feet high, 15 feet in diameter. Reinforce your forward operating bases. And so we were rebuilding some of that. But I remember Don wanted to go back to Kandahar Airfield, and because he was only supposed to be out with us for 24 hours. And so we coordinated for him to get on a helicopter to go back, based on resupplies that was coming out, because we didn't know how long we were going to be out there in Gorak. And we got word, all right, so we coordinated the helicopter. Don could get on this chopper and head back. When, lo and behold, we found out partway through the day that the chopper was no longer going to go back to Kandahar. It was actually going into Helmand province, into Gereshk, to one of the British bases, etc. So Don could no longer get a ride on it. But because he liked to make fun, because he was that day after, because he'd been out with us a few days at that point, and he knew he was going back to he thought he was going back to the airfield to get a shower and stuff. He's got a good sense of humor. He was bugging the soldiers and poking fun at, I'm going to go back and have that nice shower, enjoy myself, and have access to the internet, etc. And anyway, when we found out he wasn't going back, my sergeant major, because he was in my sergeant major's vehicle, Wayne O'Toole, Wayne said, no, let's not tell him right away. So Don was all packed up with his gear, the chopper's coming in, and then just before he's about to go out and think he's going to get on it, Sergeant Major said, no, Don, you're not going anymore. He ended up being stuck out there with us for almost a week that we were up in Gorak, and we patrolled out of there, but it was pretty quiet. So he wrote a number of articles. There were some other key events, but those were the key things. Ultimately, we lost across the battle group almost 23 soldiers, I believe. It's hard to judge with when battle groups rotate in and out, because it wasn't shortly after even the combat team that I handed off to Major David Bood, a good friend of mine that we'd done all our training, a Vandu officer, him and his sergeant major. I wasn't even back to Canada, unfortunately, when his sergeant major and a medic were killed due to an IED shortly after we handed off to them, where they hit an IED near Gundygar as well. So lots of things. We did spend the majority of that tour, though, my company in particular, combat team, living in the desert. The troops started calling ourselves the Hotel Desert Rats. So back at the Kandahar airfield, the local boardwalk, and there's lots of little sort of local Afghan shops and stuff. They got a number of these done up, and sort of this is our combat, sort of not the scorpion, but the mailed fist and the emblem there. That's the hotel company coat of arms, or I'm not even sure what the right terminology is for what we represents hotel company of the 2nd Battalion of the RCR. But they put the scorpion in. They spelled HDRs. Again, standing for the Hotel Desert Rats. So a number of us all purchased a number of these in order to, as a memento of our combat team at the time. So in the end, that sort of was that first deployment. By far the highlight of my career, really, as an infantry officer, where you actually get to do what you spend so much time training to do, to actually go out and put it into use at the same time. As you have those ups, obviously the downs, losing anybody sucks in the best of times, but when you're in command, it's even tougher. And the only thing that was tougher for me since that day was actually meeting the majority of the families and close friends of the 6 fallen heroes a couple months after we came back to Canada, and we were doing a medals parade and getting that opportunity to meet them, because there's nothing you can say to a family member, a loved one of somebody who's lost somebody in war, to reassure them or really say anything. That's the only thing that's tougher, because even to this day, I'm still lost for words on what do you say, how do you reassure them. Just know that you'll never forget them, and they died heroes. Fast forward a few years later, I was privileged, I was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, got to go back to the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment and command it back down to Gagetown, New Brunswick. But just even as I was taking over, there was we understood that where we were in the high readiness cycle, in the managed readiness plan for the Canadian Army, that I'd be deploying, or at least my battalion would be the foundation or base to form up on the training mission to then move into Kabul as rotation 1. There was a rotation 0 that was based on 3 PPCLI that had gone over and sort of stood the mission up, and this was all after the transition out of Kandahar up to Kabul. And so it was to go up there, and we'd always had a footprint in Kabul right from the early days. What was then called the Strategic Advisory Team, and it was based around a lot of senior officers up in the Kabul area that started shortly after even Op Apollo back in the 2002 time frame, where we had put in these senior officers to really provide advice to the new nascent Afghan government and to their different departments, and specifically within their Ministry of Defense, but it grew wider than that. So we always had about 150 Canadian Armed Forces personnel, mainly a lot of senior officers from across all services. At that sort of major and up, a lot of full colonels or captain navies, some generals that we always had on the footprint. But as things transitioned in 2011, 2012, as I said, we went over and we stood this capability up, and we deployed with roughly, 600 to 800 of us. I can't remember the final numbers right now, but I took over half my battalion at the time, pretty much all my leadership. There wasn't as many roles for some of the soldiers. We did have some force protection tasks to do, but the majority of them was leadership, because now the mission was all under the NATO umbrella, the NATO training mission, where it was focused on capacity building. So it was an 8-month deployment, a little bit of a change for the normal deployments for the Canadian Armed Forces, especially for unit level type deployments, where we had been based on a 6-month rotation. We were now going over on an 8-month rotation. So I'd just taken over command of the 2nd Battalion in June of 2011, and right off we kick into that sort of almost workup training right after the summer of a number of months to get ourselves up and ready, and then we ended up deploying in, I think it was March time frame of 2012 for 8 months, and took half the battalion because I'd just been promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in really substantive, effective in January of 2011. It was interesting for the positions that we were going over in. So whereas my predecessor, who had been commanding 3 PPCLI, he was at sort of the tail end of his command, was senior enough they were able to, what we call, promote him to full colonel while still employed, to sort of be the deputy commander of the mission, but the day-to-day commander of it. I was still too junior, really, to be promoted to, or even while still employed, as a full colonel. So I ended up deploying as what we called the chief of staff for the whole mission, and chief of staff operations, I should say, but as well I was the commanding officer of what the National Command and Support element. So in previous deployments, we sometimes had a separate command element and a separate support element that were, when you're on a larger mission, and normally commanded by 2 lieutenant colonels. But in this case, for the commanding, it was just merged into one, and I was sort of double-hatted as the CO, and as the Chief of Staff for the overall Canadian contribution to the training mission, because we actually ended up having about 5 COs because we had locations spread out in Mazar Sharif up in the north. We had 2 or 3 different major camps, Camp Alamo and Camp Black Horse, commanded by full colonels as COs that were on the ground as well. We had one down in Camp Julian, which is where the first deployments actually deployed to in Kabul in the 2004 or 5 time frame, if my memory is correct, or maybe even a little bit sooner. It might have been 2003 when they got out the door. Originally, when we had first deployed soldiers and Canadian Armed Forces personnel to Kabul in much earlier, about a decade before that. So we had these different footprints. We had one out in as well, very much to the west. Why am I drawing a blank? Almost in Iran. It was just a small footprint out there. I can't even think of the name of the location because we actually were able to close it down and transition the troops elsewhere. So we had a lot of more senior capability. We're actually doing a lot with the health services over there and building up the Afghan health services. But in reality, I really viewed even back then as that mission being way more important than what we were doing in all the years of really from 06 to 11 in the fight down in Kandahar. Because in Kandahar, when you're within a counterinsurgency, when you're fighting, you're really buying time, and you're buying time to allow the local Afghan forces, whether the security forces or the government, to really get on their own feet and be capable of taking care of themselves. So I really viewed what we were doing up with the training mission, which then ran for almost 2.5 years, was building that institutional capacity and institutional capabilities so that the Afghans could train themselves and be ready. And to be frank, I think we failed on that because of where we are today with having seen everything with the Taliban capable of taking over Afghanistan and taking over as quickly as they did last year. And I had the opportunity just a couple weeks ago, now in my role as a member of Parliament, to question the Chief of Defence Staff while he was testifying. And General Wayne Eyre, who was actually on that first deployment with me in Afghanistan in 2007 as the CO of the Observer, Mentoring and Liaison Team, the Omelets as we called it. And I asked him that point blank question at committee just a couple weeks ago. I said, it was the last question I asked him, and I said, why do you think we failed, or how do you think we failed? And he actually said, pushed back and says he doesn't think we failed, but he explained that and he recommended a book to read. I can't remember the name. I know I'm going to order it here likely today or tomorrow. I've got it saved on my computer to get the book ordered, but it speaks about counterinsurgencies. And really the goal and the key to ever winning a counterinsurgency is with the local political leadership. Because if you don't have the leadership that exists and that is honest, that is dedicated, that wants to take the country in the right direction, you're never going to actually win. And it's more complicated than that. That's a challenge we have in today's contemporary operating environment and dealing with counterinsurgencies. So ultimately, it is what it is. But I walked away from that deployment actually feeling quite positive that as we move forward, you could see the vast improvements in whether we were just training them on local tactics to some of the training we were doing at their command and staff college with their officers and teaching them to understand tactics and get very much more better understanding of sort of Western military's philosophies around mission command and commander's intent and trying to develop their senior non-commissioned officers and their junior officers so that everything's not just top-down driven. So I actually walked away from that mission having really felt that we had accomplished a lot, but it was a huge challenge. One of the things that we actually did on that deployment was we took one of the regional military training centers It was just training low-level tactics to these soldiers, and we turned it into a literacy training center. And we just actually supported the Afghans to bring in their own Afghan teachers to teach Dari and Pashtun. Pashtun's the main language more in the southern part of the country. Dari's predominantly what's spoken up in the Kabul area. But when you have these conscripts coming in and soldiers that couldn't read or write to a grade 3 level, that's actually how you need to fix things. The corruption that does exist, and that's, I think, ultimately why Afghanistan fell so quickly again, was there's just too much corruption still within the country, and the people lose faith in their legitimate government of the day when they don't trust them completely and they don't see the results. And so by turning that school or that training center into a literacy training center, that was, I think, a smart decision, because again, at the low tactical level, they could fight better than most because they've been fighting for 20 or 30 years at that point. So ultimately we think that was a smart decision to do, and just train them. So we trained them on everything from learning to read and write, or involved in that background, to junior officer, senior NCO development, to combined arms training, up to sort of the platoon and company level, to even sniper training, to all sorts of different things that you were trying to train them in across the country. And our motto at the time was work yourself out of a job, because ultimately if you could get that one piece of the institutional capability to that level where they could train themselves and no longer needed Western support, then that was success. And so anyway, it had its interesting challenges as well as a deployment to give people a scope of just how far along and how different it is to Canada. To go right back to that same training center, one of the things before we even got the literacy training center going up that we made to sort of give anybody watching this a scope of the challenges was when we're bringing in all these conscripts, we're obviously helping with their logistics and their support, but when you're bringing a whole bunch of few hundred new Afghan soldiers into a training camp, their infrastructure is not built to do it. Washroom facilities don't really exist. So what we bring in the blue porta potties. Well, got the phone call or question because when we call them, there's different names we call them, it's inappropriate, but the honeysuckers, as we call them, show up to empty them. They couldn't empty any of the porta potties at Camp Julian. Like, what's wrong? What do you mean they can't empty them? These conscripts and soldiers that are coming in from the mountains, in some cases, they've never seen toilet paper before. They don't have toilet paper. So when they went into the blue porta potties, even though they're all well stocked with toilet paper, they go in to clean themselves the same way they clean themselves where they come from. They go in with flat rocks. They use the flat rocks, then throw the flat rocks into the porta potties. So the porta potties now are not only full of human excrement, they're now full of rocks, which you can't suck up with the honeysucker with the truck to suck them up. So that became a logistical problem to get that fixed. And then we had to teach these conscripts and soldiers not only how to read or write, even understand how toilet paper works. So it just gives you the scopes, that the challenges that you face when we deploy soldiers anywhere in the world, depending where they're going. It's not as simple as just going to solve one problem. You're trying to other countries, different cultures, we're depending where they are, and third world country to the privileges we have living here in developed countries is greatly different. So it's not just as simple of going over and taking out the bad guys and come on home. And some of this stuff is generational, and to be frank, that's the challenge you have in a lot of these type missions around the world. And the world is becoming much more complicated than it is or not going forward. And so it is what it is. Just so, because we did get something similar to that first deployment done up, is we did up sort of these banners from our tour there, similar to the combat team one or the company level one. This is more at the sort of the National Command support element. The mission at that time was called Operation Attention. The previous missions down in the south were mostly Operation Athena, but this was under Operation Attention, which was the training mission. This is my 2nd Battalion badge. We got these specifically did up for the Canadian Contribution Training Mission Afghanistan, with the as done up bilingual with the National Command and Support element. And sorry, that was their National Command and Support element, Rota 1 sort of emblem that one of the guys came up with, and we got to put on a flag with both the map of Afghanistan and a map of, or the sort of overlay of Canada done up. So again, a bit of a memento for what we got done up, just to bring back to Canada. So I'm sure there's more I can say and talk about any of that, but I'm open to questions. But hopefully I've given everybody a bit of an overlay of my 2 deployments in Afghanistan. I'm not a big believer in the past, in reliving any mistakes. Right? We are where we are. I've been trying to build a time machine in my garage for years. I'm not there yet, so it's really hard to change the past, and you can beat yourself up forever. And again, it goes back to losing my 6 guys. You want to talk about second guessing, and how do you live with that? And you want to, every day, and still to this day to some extent, but especially immediately following it, for every almost waking minute is, did I fail to train them properly? Was there something in the direction I gave? Could I have done anything different? So that's sort of my only regret. I don't regret Canada having contributed and gone there. I don't regret that it's failed. I'm a big believer, and I've said this in the House of Commons and in the public record, that regardless of what the situation in Afghanistan is now, they spent a decade where girls could go to school and had an opportunity. And I am still optimistic that maybe one of those young girls that got an education and were trained why we were there, why Canada was on the ground, why NATO was involved in Afghanistan, will be back as the future president of Afghanistan. Maybe not next year, maybe not the year after, it might take a decade or 2. So I don't regret that, despite us having lost 158 Canadian soldiers over there. I don't think any Canadian Armed Forces member that's over there and was over there really, they may all have their own individual regrets to some extent, but ultimately when we went there at the time, you go over there believing you can make a difference and make the world a better place, and you believe in serving Canada, and that's why you can't fault anybody that's willing to put on the uniform and ultimately knowing that they can make the supreme sacrifice. So, long-winded answer for yes and no. That's the toughest thing, so that's a great question. And it's the part I struggle with even now. Not me personally. I've been blessed to my mental health's been okay, and I, despite having those challenges, I understand, right, that I can't change the past. However, it's what bothers me the most is dealing with the operational stress injuries that my soldiers or former soldiers still deal with, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's the suicides. It's the soldiers that I've lost a number of soldiers from that deployment since it's happened, but the Anderson brothers really stand out to me. Ron and Ryan Anderson. Ron was one of my sergeants and Ryan was one of my master corporals, and Ron took his life a few years after we got back, and what was going through his head, could you have done more? Is there more support? Why couldn't we reach out? And then unfortunately his brother Ryan, younger brother, was one of his best friends, and Ryan, ended up having addiction issues, trying to deal with it, and ultimately he died of an overdose just a few years ago, so a number of years after his brother. And that whole family, they came from a family that had served in the RCR. Their dad had served, just dedicated, and two of the best leaders and non-commissioned officers in my under my command, and it just so heartbreaking that they couldn't get the help, and I'll do a bit of a plug for a good friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Christian Wellington, who's a former base commander at Meaford, who just published his book Parade State Zero just in the last few months, and we just actually had him speak as the guest speaker in Ottawa at the 9th annual Sam Sharp breakfast, which is something that the Honourable Aaron O'Toole and former General and Senator Romeo Dallaire stood up 9 years ago to remember Sam Sharp, who was actually a member of Parliament and a battalion commander in Vimy in 1917. And Sam Sharp died basically of his, my understanding, I think while he was in recovering from injuries from France over in England. But my understanding, I'm not 100% sure, but I think he jumped out the window or he took his own life when he was in there, but he was still a serving. He was actually re-elected as a member of Parliament while he was still overseas in the First World War. So Christian came as a guest speaker and spoke to it, but he's like any combat arms officer writing for the first time. I mean, his book's not what you call a Pulitzer Prize winner, but it's so great because it's written from the point of Cape Bretner that grew up, joined the military. Christian and I were good friends throughout our time at Royal Military College, and then followed fairly similar career paths. And unfortunately, he's been dealing with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So we wrote a book about it, and not to do anything other than to help people understand how complicated things are and understanding the different tools that are out there. Because it's the problem with dealing with PTSD is not one solution that will fix everybody. I was single at the time of my first deployment, so I don't think there was really any impact. I mean, mom and dad, obviously, mom still gets nervous, but I mean, I love getting mom worked up a little bit anyway. I'm not the best son that way when it comes to the military. So it didn't really impact my family life per se. I was dating somebody long-term sort of at the time, and we split up just before I went because, again, I couldn't give the proper concentration. I knew I was deploying and going to war, and I had 150 people I was related to, so I've been very pragmatic that way. The toughest thing, especially from that first tour, it took a better part of a year to kind of get back to normal. When you go to war and you're going to something like when you're making life and death decisions almost every day, or potential life and death decisions, it's hard to make anything back here really seem that important. And I think that's where a lot of soldiers, sailors, aircrew, sometimes when they've been in complex situations or operations in combat, where the little stuff that gets people upset, you're looking at them going like, really? Why is this bothering you? This isn't that important. So that's, I think, a struggle where relationships happen, and family relationships. And then in 2012, I got married literally just a couple weeks before I went out the door, it didn't make it easy. Unfortunately, I'm separated and didn't work out with my ex. I don't blame the military per se. Military life isn't easy on any relationship. And I mean, but again, I think that's a bigger philosophical question anyway. We live in a society now where it's almost 50% divorce or separation rate, and the military is even worse. So it's just, it's tough when anybody, whether male or female, chooses to make a career in an occupation and a profession that demands so much, and then try to balance that out. It takes a special relationship between both people involved to make it work. But ultimately, I don't regret anything from a family perspective either. It's the military is my family as much as my blood family is too. I'll tell something that I think will be somewhat humorous 30 years from now, whenever the war diaries are no longer classified and come out. But one of the biggest things and challenges we had, as I said, living in the desert, is the hotel desert rats on that first deployment. We had no access to anything. We slept in sleeping bags, or less once it got really hot. But we had no toilets. So what we did was in fact, folding chairs, just like the one I'm sitting on, except the steel ones, the troops got smart, we cut holes in them so you could sit on them, because what we got issued was these, part of my language, but shitter bags is what we called them, and they're actually biodegradable, almost like aluminum foil looking bags that zip open like they're Ziplocs. You open them up and you've got a second compartment sort of at the top that has a little bit of toilet paper or baby wipes in it, but then the bag opens up almost like the top part's almost like a like garbage bag almost, so that when you sit down you can sit on it, and then the bag sort of sits below, but you're keeping it in a location as you sit down to do your business. And then when you're all done, you got your toilet paper that's already with it. Normally it's a good idea, especially when you're eating food over there, depends, you're going to want the normal roll, because what comes in the bag's normally never enough. And then you clean yourself up after you're done doing your business, and you put it all back into the bag, zipper back up, and then you can bury it. It's biodegradable, good to go, etc. So that's how we did the business. And it was actually way better than the blue porta potties, because in the 45-degree heat when you're at a forward operating base, it was worse than a sauna. We used to joke it's the best weight loss program. You go into one of those blue porta potties at 45 degrees, it's like 55 inside one of them. You'd walk in there and you'd sweat 10 pounds off you just if you had to go do a number two. So, to go back to the shitter bags, the sleeping bags, and then we were eating, because we lived in the desert, nothing but rations. We were eating it from a bag, so we like to say we ate from a bag, we shit in a bag, we slept in a bag, but we were short on shitter bags. Couldn't get enough of them, right? Because I'm commanding about 200 soldiers out there in the field. Could never seem we were running out of them, and then you're just kind of trying to dig a hole real quick or whatever, do your business. It was a lot cleaner when you could have this, sit on the chair, etc., etc. I'd send, whenever the troops would roll back into Kandahar, or we sent a resupply, I'd specifically write that in. But to go back to the war diaries, every day we do a daily report that would provide information about, our personnel status, ammunition status, logistical stuff, intelligence on anything that we had come in from enemy, operational type stuff. But most of my team would draft that up and fill in all the information. But the last paragraph's what we call commander's comments. I can't even think of what the right word is right now. And I'd write that in. But when things were relatively quiet, or I didn't really have anything to add to it, instead of just writing NTR, which is short form for nothing to report, need more shitter bags. So somebody's going to think that this Major Ruff from 2007, when they open up these war diaries, because we were, for the better part of a month, we were constantly short of shitter bags. Every sort of unit within the Canadian or with any military has that soldier that just gets stuff, and it would be like, I don't want to know how you get it. Find every shitter bag that you can in Kandahar Airfield whenever they roll back, because we need more shitter bags. So I just tell them to go find them. I don't care how you get them, just go get them. So I'm sure there were some American units or French units that maybe wondered where all their shitter bags went, and we ended up having them. But that's just what it is. So.